The Kalb Report is funded by a grant from the Ethics and Excellence in Journalism Foundation. From the National Press Club in Washington, D.C., this is the Kalb Report with Marvin Kalb.
Welcome to the National Press Club and to another edition of the Kalb Report. I'm Marvin Kalb. Our subject tonight, the great debates, where they've been and where they may be going. Our panelists are Sander Vanocur, an independent journalist who has worked for the New York Times, the Washington Post, NBC News, and ABC News. He's done it all and won many prizes in a stellar career. Bob Schieffer, chief Washington correspondent for CBS News, anchor of Face the Nation, and for a time in 2005 and 6, filled in between the Rather era and the Couric era as anchor of the CBS Evening News. He's also won just about every prize journalism offers. And representing the Commission on Presidential Debates, Janet Brown. She's executive director of the commission, established in 1987 to sponsor and produce presidential and vice presidential debates. She was a Reagan administration official and also worked for Republican Senator John Danforth. Finally, Mike McCurry, the Democratic co-chair of the commission. He's now a partner at Public Strategies Washington, a public affairs firm in the nation's capital. McCurry was White House spokesman for President Clinton and for a time director of communications for the Democratic National Committee. Tonight, we celebrate the 50th anniversary of the first televised presidential debate between then Vice President Richard Nixon and his Democratic challenger, Senator John Kennedy of Massachusetts. It was a debate that would forever change the way Americans select their presidents.
Good evening. The television and radio stations of the United States and their affiliated stations are proud to provide facilities for a discussion of issues in the current political campaign by the two major candidates for the presidency.
September 26, 1960. Never before had two presidential candidates faced off at a general election debate. Television cameras brought this historic event to nearly 70 million Americans. Senator Kennedy appeared at ease under the harsh television lights, while his opponent, Vice President Nixon, looked nervous, pale, sweaty, and at times uncomfortable. Senator Kennedy got the first word.
I think the question before the American people is, are we doing as much as we can do? Are we as strong as we should be?
In his opening statement, Nixon seemed on the defensive.
Is it true that this administration, as Senator Kennedy has charged, has been an administration of retreat, of defeat, of stagnation?
A panel of network correspondents took turns questioning the candidates.
I'm Sander Vanocur, NBC News.
Their questions were quite direct.
President Eisenhower was asked to give one example of a major idea of yours that he adopted. His reply was, and I'm quoting, "If you give me a week, I might think of one. I don't remember." Now, that was a month ago, sir, and the president hasn't brought it up since. And I'm wondering, sir, if you can clarify which version is correct, the one put out by Republican campaign leaders or the one put out by President Eisenhower?
Well, I would suggest, Mr. Vanocur, that if you know the president, that was probably a facetious remark.
The historic evening set off another debate. Would image be more important than substance in the television age?
Thank you very much for permitting us to present the next president of the United States on this unique program.
Sandy Vanocur, we have just established that you were there in 1960. Did you realize at the time that you were really involved in something that special?
No. I was covering Richard Nixon in Mississippi, called by the desk in New York at NBC, told to get to Chicago where I was based. I got on the Panama Limited, run by the Illinois Central, sat in a lovely dining car. I wrote out my questions and went into the studio on Monday where Don Hewitt took me, my colleagues, and just had us turn around and introduce ourselves. And that was the rehearsal. Went back to my apartment and came back that night and waited for the two candidates to show up. Nixon showed up first. Well, we didn't realize that he had banged his knee getting out of the car, and he had been suffering from a staph infection that he got in Georgia and was in pain. Then Kennedy came in. They were very cordial to them. They were friends, and Christopher Matthews has written a book about the two of them in Congress. And then they sat down and made their opening statements, and then it came to us. And then when it was over, the place just cleared out. There were no handlers around to tell you what you had seen. Or as Groucho Marx used to say, who are you going to believe, me or your lying eyes? The place cleared out in 15 minutes. And there wasn't much aftermath to the whole thing because nobody had ever done this before. So honestly, I don't think we knew what we were involved in.
Mike McCurry, what about the candidates then? Did they think? What do you think? They thought about whether they were getting involved in something.
What a difference 50 years makes now, thinking of all the architecture that goes around to one of these debates and what the candidates do to prepare for these, just so different. There's something fresh and original about what Sandy just described that I think we would like to reestablish in American politics. But from the memoirs that we've seen from Don Hewitt's account and others, they all knew this was significant, and surely John F. Kennedy knew it was significant. We often say, by the way, that people who heard the debate on radio had a much different impression than people who saw it on television, although there's a great dispute apparently now about that among historians. But it just reminds us that this is a relatively fresh medium. It's not 50 years is not a long time, and you look back and that looks like ancient history, but we are still inventing the right way in which we have our candidates encounter each other in this kind of setting, and it's a great part of our noble experiment in self-government.
Janet, in your view, what did this presidential debate and the idea of one of these things, bringing the two candidates together, having them on television, what did it do for the whole nature over the next 50 years, I guess, of the way in which campaigns were covered, the way in which candidates began to think of the use of television? What happened?
The single continuing theme in debates that started in '60, Marvin, is the notion that this is the only time when the candidates come together and are in one forum answering the same questions with no handlers, no advanced knowledge of what's going to be asked, and that all of the trappings of the campaign and advertisements are stripped away. That's what's continued, and that's what's really interesting, is that in our country and increasingly abroad is seen as being a uniquely valuable piece of the general election that cannot be replicated by any other interviews or appearances or any kind of features that are now a part of campaigns, which has lasted and interestingly is the single strongest argument, continues to be the single strongest argument for debates.
And Bob Schieffer, at the same time, after 1960, we didn't have another presidential debate until 1976. Why do you think that was the case? Why the lapse?
Well, because the candidates, one candidate or the other, up until that point, did not think it was in his interest to take part in a debate. These debates have happened when they've happened because both candidates thought, number one, they couldn't escape it, or number two, it was in their interest to do it. But, think back. I mean, most people were still the majority of Americans still got their news from newspapers in those days. No one understood until Kennedy came to the White House the power of television, because he was really the first president that mastered television in the way that Franklin Roosevelt had figured out and understood radio, which was one of the dominant media of that time. It was not until the assassination of Jack Kennedy that the whole nation watched that one story at the same time, and from that weekend on, until we got to the internet, most people then depended on television for their news. We didn't know about the power of this. Jack Kennedy hadn't had those presidential news conferences, the first news conferences that were broadcast live. You know, Eisenhower allowed cameras, but they couldn't broadcast it until after the press secretary, Jim Haggerty, had reviewed the entire transcript. They were afraid the president might make a slip of the tongue and would set off another war. So we didn't really know that much about television when this debate was held. And I was very interested to hear what Sandy said, because I bet you didn't realize just how important this was.
Bob, to reinforce what you said, I met his father, Ambassador Kennedy, at the home of Sergeant Eunice Shriver in Chicago. Shriver was managing the Merchandise Mart, which Joe Kennedy owned. And he told me, he keeps saying to Jack, you guys, pointing to me, are the future. Kennedy was very diffident about the use of television until, I think, the first debate. Now, the country knew about him through probably the Los Angeles Convention, but they didn't know much else about him, and Ted Sorensen points out in his book about Kennedy, except that he was an Irish Catholic.
You know, I'm thinking about that time between 1960 and 76, good chunk of that time taken up with the Vietnam War. And I would imagine that Lyndon Johnson, as president, and trapped as he was in the war, would not want to have his position challenged. Wouldn't those thoughts be running through his mind, Mike?
Well, certainly no president incumbent wanted to give a platform for a challenger to come along and begin to challenge the records. So that was a big part of why these debates did not get institutionalized. But we have to fast forward and give credit to two incredible party chairmen, Frank Fahrenkopf, the Republican chairman, and Paul Kirk, who decided in 1992 that they would create this commission, which Janet has been the executive director of, and say, we're going to institutionalize these debates so that nobody can refuse, so that it would become politically too costly to say we're not going to participate in what are the traditional debates that we now come to know.
But I want, before we jump that far, just to point out that, for example, I was one of the reporters in the 1984 debate between President Reagan and former Vice President Walter Mondale. And I remember at that time that my call came from the League of Women Voters. They were the ones who organized the debates in 76 and 80 and 84. But Janet, your organization, the Commission on Presidential Debates, got started in 1987. So you were in charge starting in 1988. Why did it get started? Who started? You mentioned the two people here. Was it just those two? Was it the parties? Why?
There were two studies that were done, Marvin, one by CSIS when it was still part of Georgetown in 1985, and one done at the Institute of Politics in 1986 at Harvard. Both examined a lot of very serious issues about the general election to try to understand what could be re-examined, ranging from exit polls to the debates. And the consensus of the one at CSIS was shared by Mel Laird and Robert Strauss, and a group of 40 nationally recognized leaders, was that there should be one entity in charge of debates that did nothing else, did not poll, did not lobby, did not represent the position of the candidates. It had no conflict. It was dedicated to this one issue.
Totally apolitical.
Exactly. And the Institute of Politics study, which was chaired by Newton Minow, former chairman of the FCC, basically produced a blueprint for this entity, which then Paul Kirk and Frank Fahrenkopf took steps to establish in '87. The rationale was very simple, which is this is an incredibly important undertaking. It needs to be done by an organization that doesn't have any other agenda.
Where did you get the money?
The commission is a nonprofit 501c3 in order to conform to Federal Election Commission guidelines. And so the money is all raised privately, as most C3s do.
Sandy?
Well, Janet didn't say nobody in Washington would argue with anything that Bob Strauss and Mel Laird said.
Well, and the other answer that I think is important is that the networks, that the news organizations that wanted to bring these debates to the American people defrayed the cost of the production and the, bringing the cameras. And I think that was a very, very important part of the deal there, that they didn't have to negotiate with the candidates and the campaigns over what the arrangements would be. The commission would establish these debates, and then that's what would happen. And it really is a remarkable story that these things have now become institutionalized, I think.
Bob Schieffer, in 1960, what we saw was a moderator, a panel of reporters, the two candidates. In recent presidential debates, I think starting in 92, the panel of reporters was dropped, and then you had the moderator and the candidates. Why do you think that change took place?
Well, these debates, as they evolved and as the candidates got better at it and understood more about it, they take part in these debates because they believe it's in their interest to take part in them. They're not there to give lessons on good government. I mean, let's make that clear from the beginning. And so you begin to have these negotiations about, when will you have follow-ups? When will you not have follow-ups? How long do you stay on one subject? And all of that. And so out of that, I think it finally, I think the commission decided to kind of simplify it. It would probably be easier just to go to one moderator. I mean, Janet would probably know more about that than I do. But the format became so important. When I did the debate in 2004 with George Bush and John Kerry, both candidates were so afraid that the other would show the other up with an unexpected follow-up question that it was almost impossible to ask follow-ups. When I did the last debate in 2008, which I think was the best format that we've ever had, we set the two candidates down at a small table with me. We could all touch one another. We were that close. And we just divided it up. We said the moderator will ask a question and we'll spend 5 minutes talking about it. I mean, that's basically, and it to me was certainly the best one that I took part in. It was also the most fun to just be that close to these two people who are competing for this, and just to be at the same table with them. It was very exciting as well.
Sandy, what other changes do you think will now take place? And I have in mind the new technology with Facebook and this and Twitter and whatever. Is it possible that with the new technology, the journalist becomes expendable?
I hope so.
Because?
What Bob said, I was a debater at Northwestern. Team won the national championship, but a debate was a moderator and two others. So I want the journalists out of it because I simply want to return it to.
But isn't the moderator a journalist?
A moderator can be a journalist, a moderator can be a preacher, but just as long as the moderator is fair.
Huh. And yet, Janet Brown, you've decided that the fairness is going to be exercised by a journalist.
The reason it's been a journalist is rather pragmatic, which is that I know Bob and Sandy would agree. A presidential debate is not the place to make your TV debut. There are a lot of moving parts. And what we have looked for and has worked very well is to find somebody who has spent a lot of time on television. And when they have the producer in their ear and they have two or more candidates on the stage and time limits to try to exercise to make sure it's fair and perhaps the unexpected going on, that's an enormous amount to keep track of. So that finding somebody that has done that professionally for a long time is highly advisable.
I just got to say, Marvin, I think journalists still perform a noble and a vital function in helping to inform the American people.
That line was written for him by Spiro Agnew.
I still believe that gatekeepers, there's something good to be said for gatekeepers, and that is to have a person who's there moderating and asking the questions, who's familiar with the issues, number one, who has spent some time thinking about what are the most important things we need to talk about here tonight. I don't see anything wrong with that. And I know we have tweets, and I know we have Facebook and all of that, and I know everybody out there is just as smart as I am, but I still think it helps to have somebody to funnel this all down and put some priority on what questions are asked.
Marvin, a little historical anecdote. In 1988, I worked in a primary campaign with Bruce Babbitt, governor of Arizona, who was running for president then, and we staged a debate with Governor Pierre DuPont of Delaware. And they did it what was called Oxford style. No moderator. The two candidates stood up, and one presented a position, the other rebutted, and they went back and forth, and it was a wonderful, wonderful occasion. You could do it with those two because that was that kind of environment, but in the context of a nationally televised debate where millions and millions of Americans are watching and it's down to the final choice that they have to make, I kind of agree with Bob. You need that independent editorial moderator to make sure that you stay on the subjects that are most of concern to the American people and don't let the candidates kind of slip into their own spin, their own propaganda. So I would back the role that the moderator plays.
Yeah, I back that role too, but as a practical matter here, and I turn to Janet on this, isn't it true that it's not only the reporter and the anchor, the moderator, who is accomplished at dealing with the world of television, but the candidates are now just as accomplished at dealing with the world of television and also in the manipulation of that world. So we are dealing with an instrument, a very powerful instrument, in the midst of a presidential campaign in which the candidate may end up with significantly more authority and power in the environment of a debate than the moderator. Is that not true?
I think actually it shakes out by the time the dynamics of the debate come together. It's very interesting. We've done an oral history of the presidential debates with the participants because their views up until recently were not as well known about their own participation in the debates as other people's views of their performances. And it's fascinating listening to their thoughts about what it meant to get on the stage with the person that they were challenging, in many cases an incumbent, in many cases somebody they admired for what they had done. And I think Bob would agree that particularly now, the electricity that attaches to that live forum and knowing there is no 5-second delay and there is no tape editing, that actually it has a way of equalizing things. There will always be people that are more comfortable with this medium than others, but that the whole idea is to have the moderator make it an even playing field.
But I mean, Marvin, you go back and look at this is not all about me, but I mean, to go back and look at the debate that I moderated, I didn't do much. I posed a question and then let them fight it out. And when I thought they were getting off the track, I would try to guide them back to it. But I said at the beginning, I'm going to ask the question, and I'd hope you don't hear anything from me until I say time's up, we've got to move on. And for a good part of it, it turned out just that way. But you just got to have somebody there. I mean, you can't have a football game without a referee. You can't have a baseball game without an umpire. You've got to have somebody there that's going to run the thing and keep it from going off the tracks.
Isn't it possible at this point in the history of presidential debates, Sandy, that a candidate can say, no, I don't want to participate in this debate?
When's the last time you heard anybody on television say, I don't know?
No, not on television, before he goes on television.
I don't think a candidate can say no.
Well, why not?
Because I think it will be misconstrued or construed as that he is unwilling and unfair to the other candidate, that he has an obligation to debate his opponent. And we'll start throwing in, even though these were not presidential debates, Douglas and Lincoln. It's become part of our life now. You know, in 1960, television was in its infancy. I think television started covering political conventions in 1948. So this was a novelty. Nixon was known by television because of the Checker speech and then by his debate in the kitchen in Moscow with Khrushchev. Kennedy was not known. Some people had seen him at the Los Angeles convention, but he was not known.
So from Kennedy's point of view, it's very much to his advantage,
of course,
to get on the stage with Nixon, but it isn't to Nixon's advantage to allow him to do that.
But Nixon, I think, thought he could take him, and he was not, I'm being subjective, at ease that night. Kennedy made one mistake. He didn't get up when he started his opening statement, and Howard K. Smith, the moderator, urged him to do it. But he looked into the camera, he seemed at ease, and subjective on my part, Nixon seemed to be looking at Kennedy for approval, plus the fact he wore a gray suit.
That's no good.
Well, remember,
we're all in dark suits, I know.
Those of us on the panel did not see the debate. People said, what do you mean? We saw them with our naked eyes. People who saw it on television saw Nixon against a gray background. And the 40th anniversary, I wrote something for the Boston Globe saying, after 40 years of deep thought and rumination, I've come to this important conclusion. If you're a presidential candidate in a televised debate, don't wear a gray suit.
Let me just take a moment now to remind our radio and television audiences that this is the Kalb Report. I'm Marvin Kalb, and we're discussing presidential debates with Sandy Van Oker, Bob Schieffer, Mike McCurry, and Janet Brown of the Commission on Presidential Debates. Janet, what has been the most popular presidential debate, measured in terms of the number of people who watched?
It was the first presidential debate in '92 with 3 candidates, and the first of 4 debates in an 8-day period, each of which used a different format. Talk about tricks you should not try at home. That was
given how young some people are. Remind us who the 3 candidates were. I was
going to say the candidates were Mr. Bush, Mr. Clinton, and Mr. Perot. And there was enormous fascination with Mr. Perot, who had been in the campaign in the spring, then had withdrawn, then came back in. He was seen as someone that was only concerned with one issue, the deficit. And there was great curiosity as to whether or not he would have positions on other issues and would actually be able to join the conversation on all of the other topics that were going to be discussed.
Right. And give us, if you can, behind the scenes, what are those negotiations like? I'm impressed by the fact that candidates often send either their chief of staff, their #1 lawyer, a guy like Jim Baker for Bush, for example. Why? And what goes on there that's that important? And Bob was alluding to this earlier.
It's not just the debates themselves and all the things that we've learned looking back on 1960 that turn out to be important, some of which you know and some of which you can only guess at. It is live, it is unusual, they are pivot points in a very short period of time between Labor Day and the general election. But they also, which is where I will pitch the ball to Mike, they've become a part of campaign strategy. And so the discussing of how the debates are going to look becomes something that is actually a part of campaigns trying to get in each other's heads. And for that reason, you send your A-team to start these discussions.
When you say how they're going to look, do you mean literally how they're going to appear?
The fine points, although it's been lost.
None of this gray background with a gray suit?
No gray background. What's been lost in the discussion, and this was a big part of why the commission was established, was to get away from the discussion of whether or not they would happen, and whether or not they would happen in a professional way that would be eminently fair to the candidates and would give everybody the same high quality of coverage during the debate. A moderator that was totally fair and knowledgeable and prepared to be dignified and substantive, no gotchas, no game playing. So the short story and the good story for the public is that the dates and venues and formats that the commission has established, moderators that the commission has chosen and announced early on, have not changed in a very long time. The fine points, which candidates have every right to be concerned about, in terms of exactly what they do and how they do it on the stage should be discussed, and they are. A small anecdote from behind the scenes that showed the transition from the League of Women Voters, which had done a wonderful job, to the commission. I'll never forget when a campaign chairman came to me at our first debate in 1988 and said, when will you be putting the index cards on the podium? And I said, what index cards? And he said, well, the previous sponsor had always insisted on uniform cards that the candidates used to take their notes. And I said, with all due respect to everybody, bring your own notepads. I don't care what you write on. I think you should write on whatever you would like to write on. And those are things that actually affect the television production.
And Janet, let me just inject one thing.
Go ahead, Bob.
When you talk about how they look, you literally mean how they look. Is one going to appear taller than the other? Does one guy get to stand on a little box?
Would you then show the box?
I don't know. I don't know.
Would you then show the box?
Very subtly, it was not a box, it was a pitcher's mound.
But also, and I mean, the question I would have in the debate in 2008, the last one, how did you get them to agree to sit at a small table like that? Because, you know, Barack Obama's a lot taller than John McCain. My guess is he would have wanted people to know he was taller.
Mike?
Well, you know, look, just an inside the campaign, because I've helped do some preparation for some of these. In fact, my great, Bob and Sandy will appreciate this. My role in 1996 when I worked for President Clinton was to play Jim Lehrer. So and I was not nearly as nice or as congenial as Mr. Lehrer was, but the campaign spent an enormous amount of time trying to scope out and game out every little aspect of this. But if we think back to what we really remember about all of these debates, they are the unscripted, unrehearsed moments that nobody could have anticipated. I happened to have worked for Lloyd Bentsen in 1988 when he ran for vice president, and of course the famous debate moment with him and Dan Quayle. And there are plenty.
Tell everybody about that.
Well, there are plenty of people when Dan Quayle was had been around the country speaking about how he was the representative of a new generation carrying the torch that was going to pass on. Since we've been talking about John F. Kennedy tonight, he evoking the memory of John F. Kennedy. And in our debate preparation, Dennis Eckhart, former congressman from Ohio, and I alternated playing the role of Dan Quayle, and we would kind of go through and read one of these torch-passed speeches, and Senator Benson would sit there and say, he cannot possibly compare himself to John F. Kennedy. And we said, yes, sir, he does. He's in this speech here. And we said, hey, he's no more John F. Kennedy than the man in the moon. And something triggered in there. And there are plenty of people. So that was a moment. And someone said, well, there is we had a whole team helping in the preparation of the debate. But some people said, if there's an opportunity to draw that distinction, that you actually knew John F. Kennedy, you can make that moment.
So that it wasn't unplanned.
It was not unplanned, but it was not rehearsed. That's the key thing.
Tell him exactly what he said.
He said, when the proper moment came on, he said, Senator, I knew John F. Kennedy. John F. Kennedy was a friend of mine. Senator, you're no John F. Kennedy. And then, a little bit more, because this picks up on a point that was made earlier. The power of that moment in that debate was not that Benson said it, it was that the camera was on Dan Quayle when he said it. Had the camera in this goes back to Sandy's point about what the different reaction is of people in the room. People in the room thought that Senator Benson might have come off as a little too angry and a little too crotchety and maybe a little over the edge. And so they came streaming out saying, boy, was that too much of a harsh comment? And of course, the camera angle had belied that. That was the soundbite of the campaign. And, the perception was within 24 hours that Benson had won the debate.
But you see, the camera was on Quayle.
Right.
He said it, and the picture of Quayle versus John F. Kennedy, this is something that Walter Lippmann wrote about public opinion. The pictures in our heads, they speak for themselves. They have their own stories.
Sandy, that is exactly the point, that it was something authentic and genuine was revealed in that moment. And it's just the famous Reagan saying, "There you go again." All the comments that are legendary in these debates are something that sort of crystallizes for the American public what the choices that they're trying to make. And remember, that's the whole point of these debates, Mike, is to help people make these choices.
What you're saying here is that if that was the one authentic moment, then everything else was not authentic.
No,
but
everything
the rest
else
of it was kind of phony.
Everything else was, look, that's not fair.
Was staged.
That's not fair.
Staged.
Everything else was the presentation of, what are the arguments we're trying to make? What are we saying on healthcare? What are we saying on education? And there's an enormous amount of effort that goes into making sure, how do we get down into 90 seconds what you're trying to say about it, the economy or foreign policy or these other issues, and that's important. So that is substantive, but it's these revealing glimpses that count so much in these debates.
What this goes to, Marvin, is it brings us back to the fact that the vote we cast for president is different than any other vote that we cast. You vote for a city councilman because he's the guy who wants to keep the liquor stores open on Sunday, or he wants to close them, or he wants to put the mini warehouses in somebody else's neighborhood and not yours. People vote for the person for the office of presidency that they would feel most comfortable with in a time of crisis. And it's these kinds of moments that are so revealing. It happened to Richard Nixon in 1960. We saw it in 1984 when Ronald Reagan, people thought the old fellow had lost his marbles, and suddenly Mondale tried to make an issue of it, and he said, "I will not hold my opponent's youth and inexperience against him. I will not let age be an issue in this campaign." That election was won that moment.
But let me point out to you that while that is absolutely true, the Nixon line, as well as the Benson line, Nixon in 60 and Benson in 88, they lost. So the great line is terribly important, and it's a wonderful moment in the world of television. But it's not necessarily a determining factor at all.
But sometimes you don't know what's going to come up. The first Nixon-Kennedy debate was about foreign policy. The second was about domestic policy. And then the third and fourth, the subject of Quemoy and Matsu came up. And they chewed it to death. Most people thought it was a Chinese dance act.
Most people were very well aware of it.
The other part is, Marvin, Benson was number 2 on the ticket. Some people think that he'd been on the top of the ticket and the caucus had been in the second spot, that maybe it had been a different election.
Yeah.
But
I want to ask...
the point of that was that it did draw the distinction that was a factor in some Americans' consideration about,
and he certainly won that
Sure.
debate. There was no question about it.
Let's talk a little bit about questions and the way that they are asked and the way that they're prepared for. Now, a number of people have said to me in preparation for this, by the way, that Sandy's question of Nixon was the first gotcha question. Let me tell you. I don't think so. I think it was an extremely legitimate question. But the issue that comes up increasingly as we go more and more into the sophisticated use of television is, how do you manage a gotcha question? How, for example, would you, Mike, have prepared Clinton, of all people, for a gotcha question?
Well, I did it the wrong way because I did prepare questions. My job was to, they had a big team preparing President Clinton for his encounter with Senator Bob Dole in 1996. And my job was to stay out of the room and just imagine that I was Jim Lehrer. So you can all appreciate that. And
I'd go for you.
I had a great time. I hung around and relaxed and put myself into that Jim Lehrer kind of zone.
Wrote a couple of novels.
That's right. Yeah. But the problem was I then wrote a lot of gotcha questions, and that was wrong because what the brilliance of Lehrer, and I'd argue Schieffer falls in that category, and the best of the moderators of these debates is that they don't interject themselves with those kinds of questions. They don't try to make a point. They don't put their personality forward. Because and Bob said it, he gets the credit and said it earlier, but we ought to pay tribute to that. The moderator is there to help these candidates say what they have to say. and to keep them on track, make sure that, you know, you're the surrogate for the American public. You're there to say, what's on the mind of the American people? And the best questions are, so what do you think about that, Senator?
Yeah, but
what do you think about that,
No,
Mr.
Mike,
President?
that's very nice. But let me switch to...
But that's true. That's true. Don't leave that on the floor.
No. But a moderator in 1988, Bernie Shaw of CNN, asked Governor Dukakis a question, which still rings around classrooms, and that is, Governor, do you still oppose the death penalty? If a man came into your house, raped your wife, murdered your wife, wouldn't you want to see that person killed? And he gave a very contained, controlled answer.
Dumb answer. He just said, I'd kill him.
That's a very nice thing. But what I'm getting at is that the moderator also has been known to do that.
Yeah, but that's an issue.
Well, all right, but let me ask the two reporters here. Do you think that question, you've sort of answered already, was a bad question, was not a fair question?
It's a fair question, just like you referred to a question I asked Nixon. Stuart Novins had asked that question before me. It came from a question Charlie Moore, M-O-H-R, I think he was the New York Times, asked Eisenhower in August, and Eisenhower didn't answer.
Right.
So the thing was just hanging there and had to be...
No, I say it's a very legitimate question.
Yeah.
What I'm asking is, what do you think? Was that a fair question on Bernie's part?
I think it was a fair question. I think he gave a bad answer. It's probably not a question that I would ask. I mean, most of my questions are, what did you mean by that? I mean, that's the basic question that I generally ask. But I mean, you know, different reporters have different styles. And, you know, I mean, what Michael Dukakis could have said, well, of course, I would want to kill him, but that's why we have laws. This is a nation of laws, and that's why we have to abide by the law. I mean, that was the answer to that question. I think he just gave a bad answer.
But what hurt Dukakis more, the answer to that question or him in the tank?
Probably in the tank. Probably in the tank.
Yeah.
Probably the picture in the tank. Because, again, people want someone they feel comfortable with in time of crisis. The person who understood all that was Ronald Reagan.
Oh, boy.
Ronald Reagan understood that that's what the presidency was about. You never saw a bad picture of Ronald Reagan, and it was a great political skill that he exercised.
He admired Roosevelt because Roosevelt was a magician. Henry Wallace, his Secretary of Agriculture and vice presidential candidate, once said Roosevelt's genius was his ability to have everyone's balls in the air except his own.
Moving right along. Janet, in the new age of the internet...
Did you want to comment, Janet, on that?
This whole report was worth it for that one line.
Moving right along. In this new age of the internet and the many worlds and faces of the internet, I'm wondering whether you have any concern as the head of the Commission on Presidential Debates, whether we may be getting to a point where the technology makes it very difficult to sustain an hour and a half of serious, substantive talk about policy. I mean, we've made a big effort here on the left side of the panel to stress the importance of substance. Let's join that. But we do live in this age of the internet, and is it possible to be optimistic that we're going to be able to continue that?
Definitely. And the fact is that the internet is the ultimate multiplier of the educational value of the debate. But as far as the commission is concerned, the way to use it wisely is to take what remains a fundamentally television event and then use technology to enhance people's access and the utility of the discussion that goes on during the debates. I don't think you should try to make these events that look like everything to everybody. It's very interesting. Mike was talking about it's a short time since 1960. It's an even shorter time to 1988 when the commission was established. We were talking about how the roadblocking of television by the big three, with CNN only joining the fray, was the single most important concern, that you had to have these events on all four networks and that no one could stray. Well, now, the multiplicity of the venues through which somebody can watch a debate if they want to, you couldn't count it. And the point is, I think those should be encouraged, but they shouldn't be encouraged in a way that then means you've taken the debate and turned it into something that people turn on and they say, I don't think this is dignified, I don't think it's appropriate given the office and the very short time period that's actually dedicated to this discussion. It's basically, if you have 3 presidential debates, that's 270 minutes to talk about a lot of serious issues, and that time should be dedicated to doing that.
I don't think anyone is arguing that point. I'm certainly not attempting to at all. But Mike, in this new age, I believe it was in 2008, Bob, correct me if I'm wrong on this, that there was CNN and YouTube did a collaboration, and they had folks asking questions, and then one of the people asking a question was dolled up as a kind of snowman,
right, and
was asking a legitimate question about global warming, but the presentation lost seriousness. And granted, that was not in the concluding presidential debates. That was in the dozens and dozens of debates preceding that. But you're wearing away the edges there.
Well, look, here's a way of thinking about this. I think the dignity of these events and what they represent to the American people is critical. These have become one of the reasons why they will last, and it would be very hard, going back to one of your earlier questions, for any candidate to bail on these, is because they become almost like the State of the Union. They become like the inauguration. They become one of these signature moments in our life together as a political people when we make decisions. And people know what to expect, and they know, what the format roughly is going to look like. They know that there's going to be 2 candidates or 3 candidates or maybe more, who knows, who are debating. But the thing that now happens with the new media is that you bring in this incredible interactive technology where, to answer your question, in a 90-minute debate, and look around this audience, people are going to be tweeting, they're going to be emailing their friends. Can you believe he just said that? There are going to be whole sites on the internet that are devoted to fact-checking.
So is that a good thing?
Absolutely, because it enhances this experience for the voter. I mean, it all about, at the end of the day, is how do we make this very critical choice? Who are we going to elect the President of the United States of America? What are the criteria that we are going to use together? And the internet, the beauty of it is that it is so interactive. It brings everyone in. It lets everyone become a pundit instantaneously.
But if everyone's a pundit, is any pundit worth his or her salt?
The ones that have valuable, interesting opinions that really matter and that resonate with their friends, yes.
Good ideas last and bad ideas don't, Marvin. That's been the history of the world.
It does minimize the ability of the professional journalist and pundit class to create their own fictions around what happened, because too many people are there and experience it as a live event. Now, we could debate that, but I think that's probably not a bad thing. It's probably a healthy thing.
There's one other thing to just add to this, Marvin, and that is this. The debates come at the end, which gives them a certain importance, and the American people are pretty smart. They know when it's time to stop and pay attention. They always have. These debates draw enormous audiences, and I think they'll continue to do that.
Teddy?
I just think it's the words that the candidate or candidates use. How did I want to get this country resonate? I think it resonated because Sputnik was put up first. Kennedy was furious about that. It was a signal the Russians were ahead of us. But it touched some kind of a nerve. I want to get this country moving again. So it's how you use rhetoric to stir people's passions.
You could use rhetoric in an environment such as 1958-60, and it would have a different clout, really, than it would today.
Of course.
Because today, everybody is sounding off. And what I'm trying to get at is, if everybody is sounding off and there's no distinctiveness about a particular event, and I'm trying to say here, too, that there are so many presidential, in quotes, debates before you get to the real thing.
But you see, now we got a 24-hour-a-day news cycle, not a morning and evening. I call it the electronic tapeworm. It has to be fed all the time.
That's true.
Anybody who says, I don't know, goodbye.
Right.
It's almost as if these people are paid by the word.
Marvin, let me hazard something on that. Yes, the national audience has disaggregated. The time when all of you knew Walter Cronkite and he could pronounce, that's the way it is, and we were all together on the same page at the end of the day.
That's what the way it is. It was the way
it was. The way it was. It is. What is it? Oh, no, I don't want to go there. But my point is that now these audiences are fragmented across the internet, and people, yes, they can kind of migrate to where they are comfortable. They hear things that reinforce their own beliefs sometimes. Yes, that's probably not a good thing. They ought to be exposed to more. But the successful candidate is going to be the one that brings all these subcultures together and brings us back together as a country and figures out how you take this technology and all the, the bewildering, diffuse quality of the new media and bring us back together to be one people, to be one America again. That's the candidate that will really make things happen. And these debates offer that opportunity.
Bob, let me address an adjacent question there, issue rather. You know probably better than anybody on this panel the effect or the revolutionary changes now underway within the news business itself. Are you comfortable that there will be 4 years out, 8 years out, networks such as CBS that are going to be there to cover these debates? Are there going to be newspapers around who are going to run around and cover campaigns in the way that you did and I did years and years ago? So what I'm worried about, and I keep getting back to the same point, is there a moment when the expansion of the internet, of our appreciation of the internet, and the collapsing of standards, not ethical standards, but almost structural standards in journalism, reach a point where they're going to intersect in a negative way? I mean, are you comfortable that CBS is even going to be here?
I don't think anybody in journalism and communications can say with any certainty where any of this is going. That the technology is moving so fast that nobody knows where it's going to come down. There's going to be something invented that we don't even know about yet, in the same way that the space program came about. When I was a little boy, they didn't have television. My kids used to ask me, you want to be a TV reporter when you grew up, Dad? I said, they didn't have TV when I was a little boy. So who knows where that's going to be? The technology will determine that. What we have to be worried about is what you're talking about, the standards of journalism, the standards of communication. I don't know if the newspaper is going to be printed on paper or if I'm going to get it on my wristwatch. The important question is the information I'm getting held to the same standards, gathered in the same way that the mainstream media does it now? Basically, we don't put anything on CBS unless we think it's true. Now, sometimes we're wrong, but, we don't do it unless we think it's true. Will the information of tomorrow be gathered and presented by the same standards? I don't know where journalism is going, but I know this, Marvin. You cannot have a democracy unless its citizens have free and independently gathered information. That's as much a part of democracy as our right to vote. I think we'll have that, and I think the technology will determine how we present it.
Okay, we got less than 2 minutes to go. I want to ask one question of all of you. What was your favorite moment in a presidential debate, going back to 60 or right up to 08, and start with Janet Brown? Quickly. Your favorite moment.
As the single most junior staffer in the Ford White House, watching what happened in the last debate that year, there was a poignancy we all felt about the urge to rewrite our resumes quickly.
Sandy.
I think it was the Reagan remark to Mondale.
They want to take advantage?
Yeah, but I just don't think I think Reagan's genius was his ability to have people underestimate him who were running against him.
Thank you. Go ahead, Mike.
Well, mine, unfortunately, is a primary debate. It was when Bruce Babbitt in 1988, in a big multi-candidate debate with Tom Brokaw moderated, stood up and said, I'm the only one who's going to stand up here and speak the truth, that we can't balance the budget unless we do some combination of raising taxes and cutting spending. And he had a whole program that went along with that. That's as true today as it was then, and it was my favorite moment.
15 seconds.
I have to say, it was when Janet Brown called me in 1984 and said, Bob, would you moderate a presidential debate? I'd always wanted to do it, and no one ever asked.
What a nice ending.
I was thrilled to death.
That's about the best way you can wrap it up. Because our time is up, and I'm very sorry about that. But I want to first thank our wonderful, wonderful audience here. They've been just terrific. And just as important, my thanks to this excellent panel, interesting, articulate, informative. That's it. I'm Marvin Kalb, as Ed Murrow used to say, and remember this, good night and good luck.